Criticism in general and internet criticism in particular seem to be at this distinct stage where to critique a work, whether it be a film, photo, piece of writing, or any other expressive medium, is to point out its flaws. There are thousands of hours of content on YouTube of explaining why something you thought was good was bad, why this movie is dumb, why this video game sucks, and this wasn't always the case. Before the written word, there wasn't really a record of what criticism was like. With the advent of literature came the advent of literary criticism. But unlike modern criticism, those critiques are not inherently negative. A critique would evaluate a piece of art and try to glean some sort of meaning from the art. By taking their knowledge of history, art, artists, and their personal experiences and tastes, they would offer insight into the work. This could be positive or negative, but it wasn't just pointing out flaws just to say the work has flaws. I mean, yeah, all art has flaws. And sometimes that's the reason why it's art. But modern criticism tends to focus on the attributes of a work that the critic sees as negative, as problems. And they seek for perfection when none really exist. And it creates an atmosphere of negativity and sometimes violence or threats of violence when a review goes beyond a critique and into an ethical gray area. Now, this is not to say critique or criticism is bad. In fact, I think taking a good critical look at a work can be used not only to improve the artist, but the critic as well. However, when taken too far, the critic might not be offering any actual critique, but just insulting the artist. And so into this dense cloud of negativity and anti-intellectualism that we want to add something positive. We're going to talk about movies that we really, really like. And so I present to you this new series, The Perfect 10. And I'd like to open this series with The Princess Bride, the greatest movie of all time, as proven by science. The Princess Bride, the novel, was written by William Goldman and published in 1973 by Harcourt Brace and then later Random House, now Penguin Random House. The Princess Bride, the film, was also written by William Goldman and directed by Rob Reiner, and it was released in September of 1987 by 20th Century Fox. Now, chances are you are at least tangentially familiar with the film, and while it is fan-freaking-tastic, I really want to give some backstory and talk about the book, because it raises some interesting questions and points about the nature of adaptation, and the reason why some adaptations work and some do not. Now, a lot of you may have read the book in high school if you had a good English teacher, but I know a lot of people who haven't. And while the stories are fundamentally the same, the feeling and the heart of the story, I would argue, is completely different. And while some of that comes down to the nature of adaptation, one of the big differences is in the writing of the book versus the screenplay. William Goldman wrote the book sometime before 1973 at the behest of his daughters, and at that time he had already become known as a screenwriter, with several movies having been made and even receiving an Academy Award for his screenplay of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So the story goes that William Goldman, as a kid and young man, would have his father read to him a book also titled The Princess Bride by S. Morgenstern. When his own son, William Goldman, gave him the novel to read. His son didn't quite see the satire that S. Morgenstern was going for, and so thought the novel was boring. And when William Goldman read the novel again as an adult, he found that it was quite boring. The original novel was written at a time when the author was paid per page, so many authors would take long asides describing something that would maybe be kind of important, but not really. Think of it like reading Notre Dame de Paris versus Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame. So William Goldman took it upon himself to abridge the novel, keeping in only the good parts, and published it as The Princess Bride without the approval of S. Morgenstern's estate. And he wrote it all down in the abridgment so that we can know his story as well. And all of it's fake. While William Goldman definitely tricked a few high school English students, he isn't very subtle about the fact that he made it all up by inserting himself into the narrative, by simultaneously telling a story about a swashbuckling hero and himself writing about the hero. It adds a feeling of authenticity to the story, and by making his story as fleshed out and interesting as Wesley's, we can take down our guard. The million layers of logic armor that we build up can fall away faster if we believe the story to be true. Now, I haven't really talked about the plot too much because the plot of the novel and the movie are on paper very similar. Summed up in one sentence, it's Wesley goes on an adventure to save Buttercup from Prince Humperdinck. Or is it Buttercup goes on an adventure and learns to become her own woman and gains agency in her life? Or is it Inigo Montoya, 20 years after the death of his father, finally finds a six-fingered man? Or is it Fezzik, the giant, takes a job that will change his life, where he'll meet lifelong friends and finally realize his own self-worth in a world where he's been treated like a freak? Or is it Miracle Max, with the help of three strangers, gets his self-confidence back and performs even more miracles? And I might be scraping the bottom of the barrel here, but I really wanted to show that one of the reasons why the book and the movie are just so good is because even some of the minor characters get their own arcs where they grow and change with the story. But personally, I think the plot is a grandfather reads his grandson a book so that he can teach him the most important thing in life is true love. And yes, I did steal that almost verbatim from Mandy Patinkin.
It's about a little boy who's sick at home in Evanston, Illinois, and his grandfather comes over to read him a book to tell him that the most important thing in life is true love. Now, some background on the film. Rob Reiner, having just finished his film The Sure Thing, was looking for more projects. He decided to ask William Goldman if he could adapt The Princess Bride, having read the book and loving it. To his surprise, William Goldman had been trying to turn the novel into a movie for more than a decade at that point. And so with a budget of an estimated $16 million, they started shooting with Cary Elwes as Wesley and Robin Wright as Buttercup. Now, I'm going to try to recount the plot of the film as succinctly as possible. Buttercup is a young woman living in the countryside of Florin. Wesley is the farm boy. They fall in love and kiss, but Mop Top leaves to seek his fortune across the sea where he is attacked by the dread pirate Bob. Twix is sad and promises never to love again, but 5 years later, the prince and active ruler of the land, Humperdinck, picks her to be his bride, making Butterfingers a princess in the process. You see what they did there? While on a ride, she gets kidnapped by the Three Stooges, Larry, Curly, and Moe. While on the high seas, they are followed by another boat with its own wind source.
Please, some local fishermen.
And then they reach the cliffs of Crazy Ex-Girlfriends and start to climb, but a man in a black leotard climbs after them. Larry helps him up, only to have one of the greatest sword fights of all time.
You're using Bonetti's defense against me, huh?
I thought it fitting, considering the rocky terrain.
But after a polite KO, totally not, Wesley runs into Monster Eiffel Tower, where he puts him in a headlock and down he goes! Finally, he has a polite conversation with Moe, where he explains it might not be the best idea to be a know-it-all. But instead of kissing Mars Bars, Errol Flynn nags her into following him away from Thumperdinck, who has also been following them. She pushes him down a mountain where he gets one last one-liner in, and then Skittles remembers him, grows the manliest of beards, and rolls after him. Then they run to the Dagobah system, where they find Master Splinter's cousins and escape the ground that breathes fire.
I myself am often surprised at life's little quirks.
Outside of the Dagobah system, they get cornered by Lord Farquaad, and Burt Lancaster gets captured by Spinal Tap. Again, forced to marry Charles Darnay, 100 Grand has a dream where she is the queen, but gets some sass from Golden Girl here. Then she stands up to Jack Skellington, so he gets mad and gives Jack Sparrow a massage, killing him. But Curly and Moe find him and take him to Billy Crystal. Then Jean Ferry talks smack in the crowd, while Almond Joy and Count Dracula have a lovely wedding. But after the ceremony, Black Mustache saves Milk Dud and Curly kills Dr. Stone. But after her main event, Mounds tries to body slam Monster Ruzimanoff! And then they all ride off into the sunset, where Pierre Despereaux and Dove Chocolate smooch while the Oscar-nominated song Storybook Love plays into the credits. And just as a side note, yes, The Princess Bride was nominated for an Academy Award for the Best Original Song with Willie DeVille's Storybook Love. If that plot summary doesn't make you want to watch this movie, nothing will. And I can just sit here and gush about it for hours on end, but there are a few things that I really want to call attention to, specifically how this good book was turned into an amazing movie with a few tweaks to the script and the nature of adaptation. In the book, Goldman goes on long asides to discuss his world and life and what writing the book was like for him. In the 25th anniversary publication of the novel, he even included several chapters discussing the making of the film in a similar way, up to and including a trip to the museum in Florin, where they got to see the real artifacts from the story, such as Inigo's sword and a mold of Fezzik's hands that were reportedly several times larger than Andre's. In the film, however, all of that's gone. Long asides that discuss the logistics of abridging a novel are replaced with the young Fred Savage listening to his grandfather. And as a side note, Fred Savage is only credited as the grandson in the film, so I choose to believe he's actually playing young William Goldman, first discovering the book. And while this change is great from a structural standpoint, it also helps to focus the narrative. Instead of providing the sense of legitimacy the asides had in the novel, the movie uses a storybook opening, similar to old Disney films, as visual shorthand, so we, as the audience, know it's just a story, and so we can suspend our disbelief, unless you're a loser. With the running monologue absent from the film, the next big change is the characters. While the characters are functionally the same, the characterization is much different. Wesley in the book is a dashing rogue in almost every sense of the word, and it even goes through great lengths to describe a scene where Buttercup and the Countess Rugen gaze at his glistening torso as he works on the farm. If the movie was made in the early 2000s, he would have been played by Ryan Gosling. But he's also kind of condescending towards Buttercup and very rude to her in parts. But in the film, while he can be a jerk, I get the sense that he's maybe a little bit more justified. Now, it's never justified to hit someone, especially your true love, but because of the directing and the acting, I feel like Wesley might just be lashing out because he's hurt, which, while not ideal and maybe a bit childish, is very human and a realistic response. And after he reveals himself, he's nothing but kind to Buttercup. And this is a good change to an already good character. By making Wesley likable but human and flawed, Goldman has created a hero. Not only for the purpose of the story, but for the audience as well. We can look at Wesley and strive to become like him. He effectively becomes our hero, as well as Buttercup's. Now, Humperdinck. Let's talk about Humperdinck. I personally think that Humperdinck is one of the greatest movie villains of all time. He's right up there with Mark Hamill's Joker and Darth Vader, but I feel like every time I say that at like a party or something, someone always sneers at me like they don't believe me. So let me explain. This man is pure evil. Look at it. I feel like there's this stigma against Humperdinck because he admittedly went down pretty easily, but in this one sentence, we learn so much about him as a character. So let me break him down for you. The book goes into a lot more depth of his character, just like it does for all of them, but I find the movie version as interesting, if not more so. So Humperdinck is the Prince of Florin. He's a master hunter and tracker, as he's able to deduce not only the outcome of the duel between Wesley and Inigo, but their exact movements as well. He knows poisons enough to guess that the wine was spiked with iocane powder, and he hires these three men to kidnap and kill his fiancée, just so he can have a reason to go to war against Gilder, the
Sworn enemy of Florin.
The last time someone may or may not have fudged an assassination on royalty started World War I, which will get a lot of his men killed, and he doesn't even care a little bit. Yes, I know in the books it's because he feels like he was tricked by the Princess of Gilder when it turned out she was bald, but still, that shows a complete lack of empathy for his subjects or their lives. And he has a bit of despair. I don't know about you, but the Joker, Darth Vader, Nurse Ratched, they don't have pits of despair. And even if they did, they wouldn't call it that. Like, that's pretty hardcore. And he has had multiple people down there because the albino says,
but nobody withstands the machine.
In the book, it's a zoo of death because he's a hunter, but can't hunt as much as he wants because things like, ruling the country get in the way and are distracting him from what he really wants to do. So he creates this private hunting zoo, but in the film, he does away with the zoo, so Humperdinck doesn't care about killing any old wild animals. He specifically wants to torture and kill humans. So at first, I thought he was just a sociopath, until...
Tyrone, you know how much I love watching you work. But I've got my country's 500th anniversary to plan, my wedding to arrange, my wife to murder, and Gilda to frame for it. I'm swamped.
Get some rest. If you haven't got your health, you haven't got anything.
And that seems pretty genuine to me, and it really goes a long way to humanize these characters. They aren't just caricatures, but real people. Like, these are just two buddies, just like, butting around. Like, can you imagine them, like, just getting together and shooting pool? And then, like, Humperdinck goes and is like, dude, I've got an idea for something that will let me kill at my pleasure. Count Rugen was like, dope. And he's the best foil for Buttercup. That's right, Buttercup, not Wesley. Now, there is a lot to talk about with Buttercup, and I have a lot of strong feelings about this, if you can't already tell. But with Buttercup, I think that the changes to her characters were not only great, but needed. Buttercup in both the book and the movie is the POV character, the one that is telling the story, or someone is telling it from her perspective. There are times in the novel where the narrator takes an almost omnipotent view of the events, but we, the audience, only find out information as she does. But in the novel, she's like really, really dumb. Like, Wesley has to even like spell out that he loves her with actual letters before she gets it. And she's treated more like a MacGuffin, being dragged from place to place against her will. And while she is the title character, she really doesn't get a lot of plot agency. Her choices don't drive the preceding events. And changing this is vital to making good adaptation. In the film, she is so much more emotionally aware, deciding that she loves Wesley all on her own and in less time. And she becomes an active agent in the story, where her choices do drive the plot. And a big change, and what I think is emblematic of the differences between the two stories, comes at the end of the Fire Swamp, where they get surrounded by Humperdinck and his men. Wesley stands against Humperdinck, and before they can duke it out, mano a mano.
Will you promise not to hurt him? Buttercup turned to Wesley. There, she said. You can't ask for more than that, and that is the truth. The truth, said Wesley, is that you would rather live with your prince than die with your love. There was a long pause. Then, Buttercup said it. I can live without love.
Dude, that is cold. Now, I understand where Goldman is coming from with this. In the context of the novel, he is adapting a historical text, and that, in response, is very human. Buttercup, seeing that they are both in danger, makes a choice. One that saves their lives, but separates them. And, in response, she explains that she has been without Wesley, and by extension, love, for 5 years and has survived. It might not be happy, but it's a way to get in ever after. To survive. But no matter how human and normal that response may be, it is still just cold.
I can live without love.
It's hard for me to explain, but have you ever had a significant other ever tell you that they don't love you anymore? When reading this for the first time in high school, I blew past it. But as an adult, my heart broke for Wesley. The movie, however, shows again a more emotionally aware Buttercup. While Wesley and Humperdinck are yelling, she sees the extent of the danger. Wesley thinks he can take the two swordsmen, but doesn't see the several crossbowmen that have surrounded them. While Buttercup does. The stakes are higher, and we see that they really would have died if she hadn't intervened. Even if it hurts Wesley for the time being, it means they survive, but as a result, the aftermath plays out more sympathetic. Wesley doesn't say anything, he understands at least a little, and instead of, I can live without love, she says,
I thought you were dead once, and it almost destroyed me. I could not bear it if you died again. Not when I could save you.
In screenwriting, a beat is a moment in the story where the emotions of the scene change. A great example of a beat is with this moment. With all the braggadocio being exhibited by Wesley and Humperdinck and the fear that Buttercup has, her taking this stand and saving his life changes the emotions to one of sadness, yes, but romance. The music changes, the editing slows down to accentuate the last moments Wesley and Buttercup have together. Beats like this are great because you can feel the emotions change and the story progress. And changes like this are all over the film. 15 years after the book was published, William Goldman and Rob Reiner were able to refine the story even further, adapting the book in a way not dissimilar to the way William Goldman did when he abridged Morgenstern's original text, like Russian nesting dolls of storytelling genius. Now, I want to switch gears a bit here and talk about things in the film that speak to the level of craft exhibited by the filmmakers. Rob Reiner is an amazing filmmaker, and while he has only been nominated for one Academy Award, he has had an amazing filmography as a director. This is the man who directed Stand By Me, This Is Spinal Tap, Misery, A Few Good Men, and his command over the craft of filmmaking is severely underrated, and his love for the subject matter is apparent in all of his work. He might not have the coolest visuals or the most insane camera work, but he pours his heart and his soul into all of his projects, and none more so than The Princess Bride. He takes such meticulous care to build the world of The Princess Bride in very small ways. Like, take a look at this.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is one of my favorite snapshots of the film because in just a few frames, we can learn so much about these characters. Like we know from the previous conversation between Inigo and Vicini that Inigo can fight with his left hand as well as his right. But Wesley doesn't know this. I don't think he could hear their conversation while trying to hold on for dear life off the edge of a cliff. So when Wesley comes up over the edge, he immediately draws his sword with his left hand. Inigo keeps the sword on his left hip so he can draw it with his right hand. He is always ready to fight the six-fingered man, always ready for revenge. But Wesley, who as we know,
I'm not left-handed either.
so why does he keep his sword on his right hip so he can only comfortably draw with his left? He's not looking for revenge, and he is so confident in his abilities that he feels he can beat anyone with his left hand. And in just a couple of frames, we can see that Wesley is doing the exact same thing to Inigo that Inigo is doing to Wesley. And I also love this part where Vicini is talking trash to Wesley and just goes on and on about how smart he is. But the only thing he can think to do is say,
What in the world can that be? What? Where? I don't see anything.
like, that's what I do when I try to steal my friend's chicken nuggets. Not when...
When death is on the line!
Also, when Inigo is fighting Count Rugen and he squares off against him and finally gets the chance to say,
Hello. My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
and Rugen just takes off. This look on Inigo's face, the look of pure bewilderment, and it takes him a moment to figure out that he has to run after him. You just don't get looks like that in movies anymore. That's awesome. And everything is awesome in this movie, and it's just so amazing to me to see what they did with a $16 million budget, which even at the time wasn't a super high budget. Now, I think that this might be as good as time as any to get into the book versus movie argument. Which do I think is better? The short answer is the movie, but the long answer is a little more complicated. You see, due to the nature of adaptation, books and movies will never be the same. I used to watch movies and think, why don't they stick closer to the book? And on many different adaptations, they might hew more or less closely to the book, but they will never be the same. The Road, written by Cormac McCarthy, was one of my favorite books ever in high school. I would stay up way too late and read for hours and hours about the slow, depressing slog through the post-apocalyptic world made by the man and his son. The Road, the film, was written by Joe Penhall and directed by John Hillcoat. This 2009 movie takes the book and translates it as closely as possible. On-screen scenes are in the same order for the most part, and events happen almost exactly as they do in the book. And by that rubric, it is a good adaptation, but not necessarily a good movie. You see, in a book, you can sit down for hours and hours with your own imagination and the words of the author. In The Road, I can pick up the story at any time and continue. The book is steeped in atmosphere. At some moments, it can even be palpable. You, through the words on the page, experience the slog, the existential horror of their predicament. Every page brings to your imagination images of mummified earth and decaying before their eyes. But the film shows you. Many people talk about atmosphere in films, but they mean the design, the sets, the actors, the costume, the directing, and the lighting, all coming together and creating the tone of the film. But in books, especially this book, the atmosphere is the literal air the characters breathe and that you, by extension, breathe. This is not a good film because the slow dredge through the world is boring to be shown. And the drudge through the world has little action or consequence. This might be a good addition to the Curse of the Boring Movie segment, honestly. On the flip side, The Lord of the Rings is written by J.R.R. Tolkien and is the story of Frodo's quest to Mordor. The movie, The Lord of the Rings, is directed by Peter Jackson and also follows Frodo, but not exactly. It takes the adventure in the plot and condenses or changes scenes and events to fit into the narrative structure of the film. And while the spirit of the film and the book are the same, it might not be a good adaptation because of all the differences to the text. But it is considered a good adaptation because the films are great in spite of, or maybe because of, those differences. The Princess Bride is a great adaptation for that same reason. This is one of the few examples of a screenwriter adapting their own novel. And I think this movie is much better for it. William Goldman wrote a story about himself adapting and abridging a much larger text into a just the good parts version. And it sticks to that. It takes the Mishner-esque writings of The Princess Bride by S. Morgenstern and adapts it perfectly into this shorter novel, keeping the spirit of the text, and then he was able to concentrate that text even further into the screenplay and by extension the film, turning it effectively into a just the great parts version. And with the steady hand of a masterful director and a game cast, they were able to make that story go down in history. And this is where I talk about the flaws, but the only flaw I can come up with is the marketing. I'm serious. The only bad thing about this movie is the trailer and the poster.
It was a time when life didn't seem so complicated.
Marriage is what brings us together today.
I mean, look at this thing. Look at how bad this poster is. What is this poster supposed to tell us about the movie? Look at Predator that came out that same year. Buff dude in the forest with a target on him. Sounds dope to me, but The Princess Bride? What is that? A bed with a silhouette next to it? What? And I'm being serious. This movie had a notoriously bad marketing campaign to the point that Rob Reiner burst into the office and said,
I don't want this to become another Wizard of Oz.
The Wizard of Oz also having a notoriously bad marketing push. And because of that bad marketing, it didn't do great at the box office. But it has since become one of the most beloved films of all time all over the world. And I can see why. As an adaptation, The Princess Bride is as close to perfect as you can get, making small but necessary changes to the source material to make the best movie possible. Now, there is one aspect of the film that I haven't really had a chance to touch on yet, and that is The Princess Bride as a parody. The Princess Bride, in a lot of minds, is the perfect example of a fantasy adventure story, which is interesting considering William Goldman wrote it as a spoof of the fantasy genre. A soft spoof, but a spoof nonetheless. And while the term parody might have gotten a bad rap lately, I love looking at The Princess Bride through this lens. I feel I might need to clarify what I mean when I say a spoof or a parody. A spoof is when, in a work, the author exaggerates certain characteristics of a formula or genre for comedic effect. And a parody is a humorous critique of a genre or work. If you want a more in-depth look between a parody and satire, there's a great video by Wisecrack that explains it so much better than I could, and the links are below. William Goldman intentionally exaggerates things, but not quite to the extreme. Extreme examples of parody would be like the Scary Movie franchise. But Goldman, with the help of Rob Reiner, who has a good amount of experience directing spoofs, was able to strike the perfect balance between exaggerated and in your face. But what does looking at this film through the lens of parody add? How does the story benefit from being a parody versus a straightforward narrative? I think the reasoning goes back to the influences of abridgment and the nature of adaptation. As an exercise, imagine with me that you just watched a great movie. Let's take Star Wars for an example. So let's say you just watched Star Wars and found it appropriately amazing. So you go back home to tell your friends about it. And let's say your friend is the guy from Benchwarmers who eats sunscreen, so he has never even heard of this movie. You say, oh, it's great. They have these laser swords, they go vroom, 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 and they go out to blow the Death Star, and they use the Force to choke people. And he just looks at you and says, that's ridiculous. And it is. By trying to explain in just words the complex medium of film through the even more complex filter of human emotions, you have effectively described a parody of Star Wars, where some aspects of the film are exaggerated, but others are left out. Because in our haste to talk about how cool lightsabers are, we forget to describe the scene where Luke complains about not being able to join the Empire because his uncle needs him on the farm in great detail. Even though we love everything about Star Wars, some things get exaggerated in the retelling. Some examples of parody in The Princess Bride are the characters saying their catchphrase over and over again.
Hello. My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father.
Prepare to die.
Wesley dying and coming back to life. Twice.
I've always been a quick eater.
The term ROUSs.
Rodents of unusual size? I don't think they exist.
The consistent storybook narration from the grandfather and the grandson.
See? Didn't I tell you she'd never marry that rotten humperdinck?
Yes, you're very smart. Shut up.
It's this aspect of Goldman's work, the abridgment of the larger text into the just the good parts version, that requires a bit of parody. Retelling the story while exaggerating some aspects and downplaying others. And that's why The Princess Bride is a parody and not a satire. Parody, as a critique of a genre or work, sees something worthwhile in that original text, while satire sees nothing worthwhile and seeks to critique away the flawed text. But in order for something to be considered a parody, there has to be some critique, some aspect of the work or genre that needs to be changed in order for us as storytellers to grow. And there could be any number of different interpretations of this parody, any of thousands of different philosophical theories to extract meaning from both the novel and the film. But what do I think William Goldman is trying to tell us by this parody? What do I think the lesson that The Princess Bride imparts when viewed under this lens? I think it's simple. Stop telling boring stories. William Goldman spends nearly half of this short novel explaining the process of abridging this larger, and by his own words, boring text into a just the good parts version that then he retooled and revised into his just the great parts version. And for me, the message is loud and clear. If it isn't interesting, it isn't important. And that is why this movie is perfect, both as an adaptation and a singular story. But one of the things I love most about this movie is the grandfather and the grandson. They are the framing story, yes, but they are the reason for the movie. The grandfather is here to explain true love not only to the kid, but to the audience. Wesley says, as you wish, when what he really meant to say was, I love you, and we spend the whole movie thinking that that's just Wesley saying that he loves Buttercup. And that was true, but it's more than that. It's the kind of love that makes you climb mountains, the kind of love that makes you cross oceans, the kind of love that makes you come back from the dead twice. And it's the kind of love that a grandfather has for his grandson, the love that a father has for his daughters, and the kind of love that we should all aspire to feel in our lives. And it is for that reason that this movie The Princess Bride is a perfect 10.